I'd like to welcome everyone. This is Mishnah in Depth, Bava Metzia with Dr. Rachel Furst. This is our 5th session as part of our Elul and Falzman offerings. Mishnah in Depth is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This class is following the standard daily Mishnah study schedule, where you will dedicate time on your own each day for 1 to 2 mishnayot, and we will come together once a week to review in this BEU and shiur portions of last week's material, go deeper into select elements of text, and I want to let everyone know that Dr. Furst, we love to have her back at Drisha. We always do. She's a scholar of Jewish law and Jewish history with a focus on Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, who has taught across Israel as well as in the United States and in Europe. We are very glad to have her today, and I'm going to pass off the mic to her.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Welcome to everyone. As Kayla mentioned, we are now in week 5 of our study of the mishnayot of Bava Metzia. Last week, our class focused on chapter 4, which was primarily about the laws of ona'ah, or oppression, first and foremost, monetary oppression. Today, we are going to be focusing this class on chapter 5 of Mishnah Bava Metzia. Those of you who are studying with the Mishnah Yomit schedule should be concluding chapter 5 today, actually. Today, you should be concluding chapter 5 and beginning the first Mishnah of chapter 6. So it's a good opportunity to review chapter 5. Now, if chapter 4, as I said just a moment ago, is about the laws of ona'ah, or financial oppression, chapter 5 is focused on the prohibition to charge interest, and specifically the prohibition to charge interest, as we will see, to fellow Jews. I've mentioned in previous weeks that something that characterizes Tractate Bava Metzia, or the laws that we learn in Tractate Bava Metzia, is that most of them are actually founded on solid biblical basis. That is, most of the laws that we learn in the Mishnah, most of the halachot, although some of them have a d'Rabbanan element, as we will discuss today, the basis for these halachot is largely biblical, and that is the case with the law that we're going to be focusing on today, with the prohibition to charge interest. So I'd like to actually begin our discussion today by taking a look at the biblical verses that form this basis for the laws in the Mishnah itself. Okay, so the Torah actually discusses the prohibition to charge interest in 3 distinct places, and I'd like to take a look at these different verses together. The first group of verses is from Sefer Shmot, the book of Exodus. I actually backtracked a little bit here to give you some of the context in which these laws appear. Shmot chapter 22 teaches, V'ger lo toneh v'lo telachatzenu, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You should not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The Torah goes on to say, you shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan, and if you do mistreat them, I will hear their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, etc. And it's against this backdrop that the Torah in verse 24, Pasuk Kaf Daled, goes on to say, if you lend money to my people, im kesef tilve et ami, et ha'ani imach, to the poor among you, lo tihiyelo kinoshe, lo tisimun alav neshech. Do not act toward them as a creditor, exact no interest from them. And there are a couple of things to pay attention to in the phrasing of this particular law, of this particular verse. Im tilve et ami et ha'ani imach. right? If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, as I said, I provided this background, right, the previous psukim, in order to make it clear that in fact, at least in the Exodus version of these laws, the prohibition to charge interest is specifically couched as an ethical obligation that is extended to the weaker members of society, right? Just as you shall not oppress a stranger, you shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan, so too should you not charge interest, exact interest, you should not act as a creditor to the poor among you. Right? So again, it's presented as this sort of ethical obligation, and it's also presented as something that is specifically prohibited when done to a poor person. Right? Again, I do want to underscore here that the Torah emphasizes im kesef talveh et ami, if you lend money to my people. The Torah really does seem to be focusing or to be couching this particular prohibition as one which is, again, among you, my people, meaning the people of Israel, and one among the poor in particular. Now, I said that there are a few different biblical sources for this prohibition, so I want to move on to take a look at the second and then to compare them. The second source that I'd like to look at is from the book of Devarim, or Deuteronomy, where the Torah says, Lo tashich le'achecha neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar asher yishach. You shall not deduct interest from loans to your fellow Israelites, whether in money or food or anything else that can be deducted as interest. Lenochri tashich, ule'achicha lo tashich. למען יברכך השם אלוקיך בכל משלח ידיך על הארץ אשר אתה בא שמה לרשתה. You may deduct interest from loans to foreigners. Right? And if this weren't clear enough, the Torah repeats, do not deduct interest loans from your fellow Israelites, so that your God, Hashem, may bless you in all your undertakings, etc., etc. So in other words, if Shmot already intimated that the prohibition pertains particularly to Ami, to my people, God's people, meaning the people of Israel, Deuteronomy makes that very, very explicit, right? The prohibition to deduct interest from loans pertains specifically to Israelites. It does not pertain to loans extended to foreigners. When you extend loans to foreigners, you may go ahead and charge interest. It is specifically when you extend them to your fellow Israelites that becomes prohibited. I want to just ask if you notice anything else that is distinct between the presentation of this prohibition in Exodus and the presentation of the prohibition in Deuteronomy. Right, we said again, Deuteronomy makes explicit that the prohibition is directed towards Israelites, but what else is different about the presentation in Deuteronomy? So let me perhaps direct your attention to the fact that in Exodus, the verse says, Im kesef talveh et ami. If you lend, now the translation, this is the JPS translation taken from Sefaria. JPS translates kesef here as money. Another possibility would be to translate kesef as silver. But in either way, in contrast, what does Deuteronomy say? What types of loans is Deuteronomy referring to?
They also use the word kesef.
They also use the word kesef, but they don't stop at kesef, right? Deuteronomy does not stop at kesef. Deuteronomy goes on to say, right, neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar asher yishach, right? Makes it clear that we're not speaking specifically of a loan that is extended in either silver or money. We're talking about a loan of anything, really. It could be a loan of money. It could be a loan of food. It could be a loan of anything at all, any other types of goods, whatever it is. The prohibition to extend a loan with interest pertains to any of those possible commodities. Anything else that you notice as being distinct between the presentation in Exodus and the presentation in Deuteronomy?
Well, it seems like it's the one in Shmot starts out with "Don't wrong or oppress a stranger," right? And then the second half is like, "But go feel free to wrong and oppress a stranger if you consider neshach to be wronging and oppressing." It's almost like they're walking it back a little.
Wait, I'm sorry. Say that one more time. In Deuteronomy, you're focusing specifically on Deuteronomy, right?
Yeah, is this better? Can you hear me better?
Yeah, yeah.
By Shmot, it says, "Don't wrong and oppress a stranger," right? And then in Devarim, it says, "Go ahead and oppress the stranger, just don't wrong and oppress the Jewish people."
Okay, so thank you for pointing that, right? There, that does seem to be a little bit of a contrast. One thing I want to be a little bit careful about here is that in Exodus, I provided you with the verses. In Exodus, the specific verse that refers to the prohibition of interest is verse 24, right? If you lend money to my people, to the poor among them, do not act as a creditor. You're 100% right that I provided the earlier verses in order to give us a sense of the context in which that prohibition is presented in Exodus. And the context is absolutely this prohibition of oppressing, and the stranger is highlighted as someone who we are prohibited to oppress. Now, in Deuteronomy, it does say very explicitly that one may deduct interest from loans to foreigners. Now, that was not in Exodus. Again, the Torah says explicitly you're not allowed to oppress a stranger. The Torah intimates maybe that the prohibition to lend at interest is exclusively directed at the people of Israel, insofar as the Torah says in verse 24, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, right, that sort of intimates that maybe the Torah is talking specifically about the people, the Israelite people, whereas Deuteronomy makes that very, very explicit. I think that what you're pointing out is you're pointing out something else that we should pay attention to, which is that the Torah doesn't explicitly say that the prohibition to charge interest is about oppression, right? But you are correct that in Exodus, it is presented in the context of this series of laws that prohibit oppression of various categories of people. And so it suggests that there's something about lending interest that could be oppressive. Now, I want to underscore the fact that in Exodus, where this whole thing comes up in the context of oppression, the Torah specifies that the prohibition is to lend interest to poor people, to lend at interest to poor people. Deuteronomy doesn't specifically say anything about poor people, right? It talks about not deducting interest from loans to Israelites, but it doesn't specify that the Israelites entailed are necessarily poor. Now, with that in mind, I want to take a look at the final source from the Torah that deals with the prohibition to charge interest, and that is this series of verses from Sefer Vayikra, or from the book of Leviticus. And let's pay attention to the way that Leviticus phrases the matter in contrast to what we saw in Exodus and Deuteronomy. The Torah here says, "V'ki yamuch achicha umate yado imach v'hechazakta bo ger v'toshav v'chai imach." If your kin being in straits, right? So it doesn't exactly say poor here, but it says being in straits, meaning ki yamuch achicha, which implies that they are not financially stable, that they're having some difficulty, financial difficulty. If they come under your authority and are held to you as though resident aliens, let them live by your side. And specifically, al tikach mi'ito neshech v'tarbit, v'yareta me'elokecha v'chai achicha imach. Do not exact advanced or accrued interest. And here, by the way, I want to point out that this advance or accrued interest is the way that JPS has chosen to translate the Hebrew terms neshech v'tarbit. And I'm pointing that out, I'm underscoring that here because we're going to come back to that. We're going to see that the Mishnah actually explains those terms in a slightly different way, right? But for whatever reason, JPS has decided to translate it as advanced or accrued interest, but fear your God, et cetera, et cetera. And Pasuk Lamed Zayin or 37 goes on to say, do not lend your money at advanced interest. And again, that's beneshech, nor give your food at accrued interest. And that's tarbit, marbit or tarbit, right? So in the Hebrew, it's et kaspecha lo titen lo beneshech, uvimarbit lo titen ochlecha. I, Hashem, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, to be your God, etc., etc. Okay. So let's again hone in on what we said beforehand. Do you notice anything particular about Leviticus, about the way the Torah presents this prohibition in the book of Vayikra as compared or as contrasted to the way that it presented it in Exodus or Deuteronomy? And you can keep in mind the points that we've already raised. What is distinctive about the presentation in Vayikra?
I guess the first thing I notice is that when I think of interest, I think of ribis, or rabit. And I think this is the first time we're seeing that word.
Okay, so that's a very good point, which is that the term marbit, right? The term that gave rise to the word that we're perhaps familiar with, ribit, that appears in Vayikra. It does not appear in Exodus or Deuteronomy, which talk is specifically about neshech. Now, the term neshech appears in Vayikra as well. Both terms appear in Vayikra, but they don't. But the term tarbit, marbit, ribit does not appear anywhere except in Vayikra. That's a good point to note, and we're going to see again that that's something that the Mishnah picks up on in its attempt to define what do these terms mean. Okay, so that was a good thing to note. Anything else that you note here that is distinctive about Leviticus or similar between Leviticus and either Exodus or Deuteronomy?
I mean, it seems to combine the idea of specifically not lending money to people who are financially insecure with interest.
Okay,
and
so in that respect, it's like Exodus, right? More similar, more akin to Exodus than to Deuteronomy, because we said in Deuteronomy doesn't specifically raise the issue of poor people, right? But Exodus certainly does. So that's a way in which Leviticus is more similar to Exodus. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Miriam. Please go ahead.
No, that's okay. But then the other half of it is, it says specifically achicha, so, as opposed to, the nochri or something. So it's kind of combining both of them, perhaps.
Okay. And so here too, exactly as you said, here too, the emphasis seems to be on pointing out here to kiyamuch achicha, right? So your kin being in straits, right? So I think Deuteronomy, we can summarize by saying that Deuteronomy is most explicit about the focusing this prohibition specifically on Israelites and not on foreigners. But we do see a little bit of that in Leviticus as well, similar to the way that we saw it intimated in Exodus. I also want to point out here that whereas in Exodus, we saw specifically kesef, which again we said was either money or silver mentioned. In Deuteronomy, we saw money, food, and anything else mentioned. Here, Leviticus also mentions both money and food and makes it clear that we're talking about a prohibition that does not pertain to one particular type of commodity. Okay, so with all of that in mind, I want to now turn our attention to the mishnayot themselves. This is again, as I said, this is very clearly the biblical basis for the discussion that we're going to have in the Mishnah. However, as we're going to see, the definition of ribit de Rabbanan, of sort of the rabbinical form of prohibited interest taking, which is sometimes called avak ribit, or sort of the dust of ribit, is somewhat different than the biblical prohibition itself, the isur deoraita, the biblical prohibition of taking ribit. And just to make that very, very clear, what the biblical prohibition seems to entail is to give a loan at interest that was set from the very outset. So in other words, if from the very beginning you extend a loan to somebody and you say, I am giving you 100 shekel, and I expect that at the end of the loan period, you will return to me 120 shekel, that is ribit deoraita. That is the prohibition, the biblical prohibition of extending a loan at interest, with interest. We're going to see, as we turn to the Mishnah now, that the Mishnah talks about a whole range of other types of prohibited activities that are deemed by the rabbis to constitute a form of interest, although they do not match that classic biblical definition. So let's begin by taking a look at the first Mishnah in the chapter. Right? And Mishnah Bava Metzia 5:1 begins by asking the very basic question, and again, it's clearly formulated on the basis of those verses that we just saw in Sefer Vayikra in the book of Leviticus. Ezehu neshech ve'ezehu tarbit. Which is neshech and which is tarbit? And again, just let's flip back for one moment just to make this very, very clear. Right? The verses in Leviticus, specifically verse number 37, says, Et kaspecha lo titen lo beneshech, uvimarbit lo titen ochlecha. And again, as Miriam pointed out, that's the only time in the Torah that we hear those two different terms, as opposed to just neshech. But the Mishnah underscores that particular verse and says, okay, we have two terms here. What do each one of them mean? Seems to assume here that there must be distinct meanings if the Torah use these different terms. So the Mishnah says, Ezehu neshech, let's start with neshech. Hamalves sela b'chamisha dinarin, se'atayim chitin b'shalosh, mipnei shehu noshech. So neshech is referring to one who lends to another a sela, which is worth 4 dinarim, for 5 dinars to be paid later, right? So exactly the case that we just said, right? You lend somebody a certain amount of money and you expect to get a larger sum in return. Or similarly, someone who lends 2 se'ah, se'ah is a measurement of wheat, for 3 se'ah to be returned later, right? This is basic prohibition of neshech, of lending at interest, because it is noshech, right? And here I want to pause for a moment and to just note the word noshech, as Rashi on the basis of various midrashim points out, sounds like to bite, the verb to bite, right? And the idea behind neshech, behind taking interest, is that it really, it bites the lender. It bites the borrower, I should say, right? The person who has to repay a significantly larger sum than what he or she borrowed ends up getting sort of bitten, ends up suffering as a result, particularly if we think about these loans as per the verses, particularly the verses in Exodus that we saw, if we think about a loan that's being extended to a poor person. As compared to neshech, the Mishnah goes on to ask, ve'ezehu tarbit. So what does that second term mean? And here the Mishnah says, it is the case of one who enters a transaction that yields an increase in the produce beyond his investment. So it's hamabe bepehot. Ketzad. What do we mean? For example, if someone acquired wheat from another at the price of 1 core of wheat, right? Core is again a measurement of wheat, a quantity of wheat. So he charges 1 core of wheat. He says, I'm going to lend you 1 core of wheat for 1 gold dinar, which is worth 25 silver dinars. Right? That's how much wheat I'm going to give you to lend you now. With the wheat to be supplied at a later date, and such was the market price of the wheat at the time he acquired it. Right? So in other words, they make this arrangement, right? Let's use the names Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain asks Shimon to lend him wheat. Ruvain is, again, the borrower. Shimon is the lender. Shimon agrees. And at the time they make the agreement, wheat costs 25 silver dinarim, or 1 gold dinar, per core of wheat. Now they make the arrangement, and that's the price at the time they make the arrangement, but the wheat itself is actually going to be supplied at a later date, right? They sort of preemptively make this arrangement. And in the meantime, the price of 1 core of wheat increased and stood at 30 dinarim.
This reminds me of futures.
Yeah, a little bit like that.
That's
Now,
what I was wondering. Are we short selling here? I mean, the difference is that when you short sell, you're committing to buying it back at whatever the market price is then. But here, I don't think you've made that stipulation.
No, they made an arrangement. At the time, they made an agreement at the time that the wheat was, again, one particular price, that is 25 dinar, and then the price of wheat increased, right? Before the wheat was actually, the promised wheat was actually supplied. I don't think this was purposeful. This is just the way that it transpired. Now, at that point, the buyer said to the seller, "Give me all of my wheat now, as I wish to sell it and purchase wine with it." Right? So he wanted the wheat now because, again, the wheat has increased in value, and he says clearly he tends to purchase wine with it. At which point the seller said to him, "Since it's ultimately wine that you want and not wheat, then let's make a new deal, right? Each core of your wheat is considered by me to be worth 30 dinars, and you have the right to collect its value in wine from me. In other words, I'm not going to give you the wheat. I'll just supply you the wine that you ultimately want." And in this case, the seller did not have the wine in his possession, but the seller who's offering this new arrangement doesn't actually have the wine yet. Now, according to the Mishnah, right, or what's implied by the Mishnah is that if the wine appreciates in value, the result is going to be an interest-bearing transaction because the buyer is going to be collecting from the seller wine that's worth more than the wheat for which he paid, right? So this is it's a little bit less, it's clearly a less direct form of interest taking than the first example that we called neshech. But this, claims the Mishnah, is what is meant by marbit or ribit. Tarbit, right, is the language that the Mishnah uses. Miriam, do you have a question? I see your hand has been up.
Oh, sorry. No, that was the question about, I'll see if I can figure out about the short selling.
Great. That's all right. Okay. Now I want to point out, so the Mishnah seems here to be implying that there is a difference between these two terms, neshech and marbit, as we saw in the Torah itself. But there's something a little bit strange about what the Mishnah is suggesting here. And the Gemara, although we're not studying the Gemara together, I do want to point out that the Gemara notices this right away and asks, right, and this is the opening passage of the Gemara, specifically the Talmud Bavli Tractate Bava Metzia, 60b is the very first passage of Gemara on our chapter 5, chapter Ezehu Neshech. So the Gemara begins by asking, from the fact that by explaining the term tarbit, the Tana sets aside the topic of interest by Torah law and instead explicates a case of lending with interest that is prohibited by rabbinic law, one can conclude by inference that by Torah law, neshech and tarbit are one matter and there's no halachic distinction between them. Right? So what the Gemara seems to be suggesting is, okay, let's go back, let's think back to the Mishnah for a second. Right? We said before that ribit deoraita is specifically, the Torah-based prohibition of taking interest is specifically when it's clear and straightforward, right? I'm giving you 100, you're giving back 120. And they agree on that at the time of the loan itself. That's Torah-based prohibited interest taking. And anything else is basically rabbinic. So based on the way the Mishnah defined the difference between neshech and tarbit, right? Again, going back to the Mishnah that we just saw together, neshech is seems to be the straightforward Torah-based prohibition. And ribit seems to be, again, this sort of convoluted, much more complicated case that sort of in a way entails taking interest, right? So it seems, says the Gemara, that the Mishnah assumes that neshech it understands neshech to be the rabbinic, the Torah-based prohibition, whereas tarbit is the rabbinic prohibition. But again, keep in mind, as we've already pointed out a few times, the verse in Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, uses the word marbit itself. So how could it be that tarbit refers to a rabbinic prohibition? That's language that's derived directly from the verse of the Torah. So the Gemara suggests that the Mishnah must be inferring that according to the Torah does use these two different terms, but really it means it's just using, we say Dibra Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam, right? That the Torah is using synonyms, essentially. The Torah is using, sort of richer language, doesn't want to repeat the same thing twice, maybe a sort of more poetic way of talking. And so it uses these two terms, but from a Torah-based perspective, neshech and tarbit are one matter, and there's no halachic distinction between them. But then again, the Gemara says, but aren't verses written using the term neshech for interest that's on a loan of money, and tarbit or marbit, which are cognates of the term ribit, for interest that's on a loan of food, right? If we flip back for just one moment to the verses in Vayikra down at the bottom of this screen, you can see again in Leviticus, verse number 37, or Pasuk Lamed Zayin, Et kaspecha lo titen beneshech, u'bemarbit lo titen ochlecha. Right, so the Torah seems to be contrasting neshech, which is about money, versus tarbit or marbit, which is about food. So no, the Torah doesn't seem to think that they're both one and the same thing. What are you talking about, says the Gemara. But then the Gemara says, wait a second. Can you understand that there's neshech without tarbit and tarbit without neshech? Right, and here, just to understand what the Gemara is really asking here, the translator here explains or provides a little bit of background. The term neshech, from a root meaning to bite, as we said, connotes loss to the borrower, where the term tarbit, literally increase, connotes profit to the lender, right? So in other words, they're two sides of the same coin. There can't be neshech without tarbit or marbit, and there can't be marbit without neshech. Then the Gemara goes through a sort of extended series of examples to prove that that is so, and concludes on 60b, rather, Rava said, you do not find neshech without tarbit, nor tarbit without neshech, and the verse distinguished between them only so that lending with interest always involves violating two prohibitions. Right? So in fact, they're not really distinct from a biblical perspective, but they refer to two violations. If one charges interest on a loan, one in fact violates not only the prohibition of neshech, but also the prohibition of marbit, even though technically speaking, they're pretty much the same. You can't commit one transgression without committing the other. Right? But in order to sort of increase the sense of prohibition, the sense of forbidden activity that is involved here, the Torah, in fact, renders it such that one who lends at interest is violating more than one biblical prohibition at the same time. To make this yes, if someone has a question, please go ahead.
I can think of a situation in which you would have one and not the other. If I loan out the wheat at a price of $20, right, whatever, and you have to pay me $25. Okay, so that's taking the bite out of you, right? The neshech,
right?
Right. but then the price, but I haven't like bought the wheat yet to give to you. But then the price of wheat goes up, and so I have to pay $30 to buy this wheat. And so I did not marbit. My profits did not increase, quite the opposite, because you're only going to give me $25 back. But I've entered into this agreement. So I don't have marbit, but the person getting the wheat from me does have neshech.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds that would be the way that it would sound. But that's why I think the Mishnah already renders that situation a little bit more complicated and says in that particular case, probably we can imagine that the lender would in fact try to, right, that's perhaps, you know what, it's a good question. I think that that's why the Mishnah creates the more complex case. If it were to stop at that, and in fact, the lender only wants to receive the wheat, I'm sorry, the borrower, excuse me, only wants to receive the wheat and does not want to receive it in kind, meaning does not want to receive it with wine instead of the wheat, and so that they, you know, the borrower ends up making a new deal. That's a good question. I will have to get back to you on that particular one. The Gemara, I didn't bring all of the cases here in which the Gemara tries to demonstrate that it is impossible to have one without the other. But I would suggest that you take a look, if you go to the source, and again, I apologize, it's not on the sheet right over here. It's not on the slide. Excuse me, I'm talking about really the previous slide to this one, this over here. I basically just, in order to make our discussion a little bit more simplistic, cut out the back and forth that the Gemara has here to demonstrate that there can't be neshech without tarbit and tarbit without neshech. But I would suggest you take a look at that. I'll take a look at that as well, and perhaps we can return to that and try to make that a little bit more clear next time. But that's a good question that you asked. In any case, what I want, just speaking about neshech and tarbit as containing multiple violations, I want to take a look quickly at the very final Mishnah of our chapter, and that is Mishnah 11, because in Mishnah 11, the Mishnah teaches, it expounds upon, first of all, who is in fact violating the prohibition of ribit when a loan is lent at interest, and also which exactly biblical prohibitions they are violating. So the Mishnah here says these people violate a prohibition of interest: the lender and the borrower and the guarantor and the witnesses. Right, which sounds like more than what the Torah itself was referring to. Right, the Torah seems to only focus on the lender and the borrower, but the Mishnah expands the circle of people who are involved in this violation. The rabbis say not only are we talking about the lender, the borrower, the guarantor, and the witnesses, but as even the scribe who writes the promissory note violates this prohibition. Now, the parties to the transaction violate different prohibitions. Some are in violation of, you shall not give him your money with interest, lo titen, right? And that's the verse in Vayikra that we saw. Some of them are in violation of, do not take from him interest or increase, another one of the verses that we saw from Vayikra. Some do not be to him as a creditor, which is one of the verses that we saw in Sefer Shmot, and do not place interest upon him, which is also from that verse in Shmot. And finally, some are in violation of a prohibition that seems not specifically related to interest, but sort of a more general one that could cover interest. And you shall not place a stumbling block before the blind, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. And the Gemara goes on to say that the lender, one who actually extends a loan at interest, violates all 5 of these biblical prohibitions. The borrower violates the first 2 and the 5th one. The witnesses violate the 4th one. The scribe also violates the 4th one, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one question that we might want to ask ourselves more generally is, why would the Mishnah try to expand or make a point of expanding this circle of transgressors. What is the Mishnah trying to convey to us by referring to these biblical verses on the one hand, but insisting that they pertain to a wider spectrum of people than the Torah itself involves? Any ideas about that?
Perhaps that there is an insidious nature to interest, that it has an effect, a broader effect than just on the person who is charging interest and the person who is benefiting and the person whom is it affecting. In other words,
so that it sweeps up all these other people into its
and society in general, that it there is a corrupting, I know it's necessary for economic reasons, but that there is that it has another effect to it. It's a widening circle there.
Yeah, I think that that's a nice way of putting it. Certainly the Mishnah here seems to be underscoring the significance, the real seriousness with which the rabbis viewed this particular type of activity, that it's, even worse than the Torah makes it out to be, or it really, it catches all that many more people in its snare, as you said.
It also it also prevents future rabbis from finding a way to permit it, because you can't have witnesses, and then the courts can't do anything with it.
Well, again, the witnesses that we're talking about here are presumably the witnesses to the original loan, right? The loan that was lent at interest. And that the witnesses to a loan lent at interest are parties to the violation, right? They weren't the ones lending at interest. They weren't the ones borrowing at interest, right? But they are party to this transaction, which entails a biblical prohibition, and thus they too are considered liable for the biblical violation, right? That's the idea here, I think. And the same thing would go with the guarantors and, according to the rabbis, the scribe, right? These are not the main parties who are engaged in the activity, but as accessories to the transaction, they are considered also liable. Yeah. Okay, I just want to take a moment here before we go on. Now that we've discussed the basic prohibition from the Torah and the way that it translates into the mishnayot, at least the opening and closing mishnayot of the chapter, to take a quick look at, this is a quick overview of the mishnayot in chapter 5. Right, we saw Mishnah 1, which is a prohibition, talks about the prohibition to lend to a fellow Jew at interests, and provides those different definitions that we saw of neshech and tarbit. Mishnayot 2 and 3 talk about prohibited forms of usury. And again, here we're talking about on a rabbinic level, midirabanan, right? These are forms of usury that do not constitute ribit deoraita, the very pure, basic lending at interest, but nonetheless, according to the rabbis, constitute usury and are prohibited. Mishnayot, yes.
This was written long before the Middle Ages, when the Jews were forced to do this.
Yeah,
right?
We're going to talk, yes. I think what you're alluding to is that sort of infamously or famously or infamously, in medieval Europe in particular, lending at interest, in fact, became a kind of Jewish profession, right? Jews, for various reasons, not all Jews were professional moneylenders, but for various reasons, many Jews in medieval Europe made their livelihood by lending money at interest. This was in a time before official banks, so they essentially served as bankers. They were engaged in money lending at a small scale, and some were engaged at money lending on a very, very significant scale. And one of the reasons, Jews were by no means the only people in medieval Europe who were money lenders, who lent at interest. But one of the reasons that Jews got into the profession is because the church very famously prohibited
Right.
Christians from lending at interest, based on these same biblical ideals. Now, I think you came in a little bit late, Deborah, when we were talking about the verses and underscoring the fact that the Torah specifically prohibits lending to fellow Jews at interest. And the Torah, and in particular, the verses in Deuteronomy, make it very explicit that that prohibition does not extend to non-Jews. And as a matter of fact, we're going to see it in just one moment when we get to Mishnah 6. I wanted to point out that Mishnayot 4, 5, and 6, first and foremost, talk about prohibited business partnerships that nonetheless constitute, right? You wouldn't think of them necessarily as lending at interest, or at least not at first glance, because they're not directly about extending a loan. But nonetheless, the rabbis insist that the type of partnership entailed actually constitutes lending at interest and is therefore prohibited. Mishnah 6, the second part of Mishnah 6, goes on to focus on the permission, right, the flip side of all of this, which is the permission to, in fact, lend to non-Jews at interest. And here I also want to just very briefly go back to the discussion that we had concerning the biblical verses, right? Miriam, you pointed out, and we saw together that the verses in Exodus in particular seem to talk about lending and lending to poor people in particular as being one of a series of prohibitions of oppressing marginal or weaker members of society. But in and of itself, right, the Torah seems to be focusing the prohibition on not lending to poor people and not lending to members of the tribe, right? So that for the Torah, not lending at interest almost seems to be a form of required charity. You have to be charitable towards other people, particularly towards poor people, particularly towards members of your own tribe who might be in dire straits. But that being said, I don't think it's necessary to understand the Torah and subsequently the rabbis' permission to lend to non-Jews at interest as suggesting that it's permissible to oppress a non-Jew. Right? Lending at interest in and of itself is not an immoral act. It is perhaps an amoral act, but it's not an immoral act. Right? It's a type of business transaction. It's in fact what allows the economy in many cases to function. And so even though the Torah and subsequently the rabbis underscore the importance, the significance of not lending to Jews, and particularly poor and downtrodden Jews at interest as a form of, again, charity or communal solidarity, I don't think that what the Torah or the rabbis are implying here is that it's okay to oppress a non-Jew. It's simply, right, they're not included in that category of people that we particularly need to look out for. And by the way, I meant to mention this beforehand, but I'll just allude to it briefly now. Some of the verses that we saw that refer to interest or the prohibition of interest in the Torah are actually the basis for in a sort of unrelated rabbinic ruling, which is that charity itself is supposed to be extended first to the inner circle, to the people of your family, of your town, of your neighbor, right? To your obligation in charity pertains to the inner circles, to the people closest to you before it pertains to the people who are a little bit further away from you. And that again is because the Torah really emphasizes in these verses imach, right? The idea that we're talking about people who are close to you, who are part of your inner circles.
Can you
In any
help me
case,
understand? It seems like if the rabbis are making a distinction and they're saying that it's not oppressive as long as the person that you're lending, the non-Jewish person that you're lending to, is, comfortable and able to bear the cost of the interest. So then why don't we give, interest-bearing loans to Jews who can't afford it?
Okay, and so that's an excellent question, and I just want to defer that question for one moment. We're going to get to it in just a minute. I want to defer it only to continue taking a look at this overview of the chapter. Right, we said that's Mishnah 6 that really that hones in on the permission to lend to non-Jews. Mishnah 7 talks about cases in which it's prohibited to pay for a purchase in advance as it constitutes or lest it constitute interest. Mishnayot 8 and 9 talk about prohibited and permitted cases of lending produce for produce and how that could create a situation where interest is in fact being charged. Mishnah 10, which we're going to see in a minute, talks about prohibited and permitted work arrangements, which again don't seem to be about extending loans, but nonetheless fall into this category of avak ribit, of cases that the rabbis consider related enough to be prohibited. It also gets into general definitions of usury and something called verbal usury, right? Much as we saw verbal ona'ah or verbal oppression in the last chapter, discussed towards the end. In Mishnah 11, we saw about the different transgressions and transgressors associated with the biblical prohibition. Now, again, you asked about what in fact is the prohibition? What is the problem, excuse me, with lending at interest if we're not talking about poor people, if we're not doing it in an oppressive way? And here, excuse me, let's just move forward for a moment. I want to take a look at something. I want to refer briefly. This is obviously can be a subject for a very extended and in-depth study that we don't have time for today. But I want to note that the rabbis were cognizant of the problematics of making lending at interest a prohibited practice and such a broadly prohibited practice. And that is, look, that's the way the business world works, right? People need to take out loans, and loans are made at interest because there has to be some incentive for the lender to give them. And if we're not talking about people who are, who he feels or she feels directly responsible for, either because they're from their community or because they're poor or because they're fellow Jews or whatever it is, then the incentive for them to lend the money to begin with is going to be the business sense, right? It's going to be getting the interest. And that pertains not only, as you were suggesting, Miriam, I think, to when you extend loans to non-Jews, but even within the Jewish community, right? If we're talking about business deals and business interactions, right? Not poor people, not people who are, inherently weak and oppressed, etc. But if we're talking about business transactions between Jews, then there has to be some kind of way to circumvent certainly all of these many cases that the rabbis pulled into the umbrella, under the umbrella of prohibited interest. And the way that the rabbis dealt with that was by creating a sort of legal loophole, creating a legal instrument, I should say, that functions as a type of loophole. It functions as a way of permitting the prohibited. And they called that a heter iska. And a heter iska, right? As you can see here, this is this version of the heter iska, which is used until today. This is the version that is provided by the Beit Din of America, but there are many different versions that are in circulation that are in use currently. The Beit Din of America provides this brief little introduction that perhaps we'll read together. Jewish religious law strictly prohibits the paying or receiving of interest on loans made between Jews. However, when monies are advanced in the course of a business transaction, an agreement may be entered into whereby the provider and receiver of these funds are considered equal partners, right? So the way to avoid or the way to circumvent the prohibition of lending at interest is to call the loan a business partnership rather than a loan, right? And as soon as it becomes a business partnership and not a loan, then many of the problems are obviated. This partnership is based on the stipulation that upon request, every loss must be attested to by two trustworthy witnesses, all profits verified by an oath. All consequent profits and losses are then equally shared. However, in order to avoid these very stringent requirements, the provider of the funds under this shtar iska agrees to waive his share of the profits in lieu of receiving a fixed percentage of the money advanced. This percentage is then considered profit rather than interest on a loan. right? So in other words, it turns the loan into an investment, right? And if you invest in something, then you can receive payment in return. You can receive the profits of that accrue to you on your investment, and it no longer becomes prohibited interest, it becomes profits on an investment. And by the way, I want to point out that this heter iska plays with some of the rules, or some of that were set out in the mishnayot themselves, when the mishnayot mishnayot here 4, 5, and 6 went through this whole discussion. I'm sorry, not mishnayot 4, 5, and 6. I think it's more 7 and 8. 7, 8, and 9, which talk about prohibited and permissive cases of lending produce, but also different kinds of partnerships that constitute lending at interest, right? The Mishnayot, the principles that the Mishnayot there developed are some of the principles that are behind this concept of the heter iska, which is, again, today, banks in Israel, when they, lend money people for mortgages or for various purposes, they basically ask people to sign an agreement that reads something akin to what you see here, which again has the legal effect of turning a loan into an investment and thereby just avoiding the problem and the prohibition. So I hope that answers your question, at least in brief. Before we conclude, and again, as I said, I encourage you to look into that a little bit further. It's obviously a much larger halachic topic than we can deal with today together. But before we conclude, I do want to make brief reference to Mishnah 10, chapter 5, Mishnah 10, where, as I mentioned to you beforehand, the Mishnah begins by talking about various work arrangements that, again, don't seem on the surface of things to have anything to do with loans at interest, but nonetheless, according to the Mishnah, constitute this avak ribit, right? Dust of ribit. For example, a person might say to another, weed the wild growths from my field with me now, and I'll weed your field with you at a later stage. Or till my field with me today, and I'll till with you on a different day, right? That's okay. That you're allowed to say. You're allowed to make a tit for tat kind of arrangement in that way. But what you're not allowed to agree with your fellow is weed with me today, and I'll till with you on a different day. Or till with me today, and I'll weed with you on a different day. Because it's possible that due to the nature of the different tasks, one of them is going to have to work harder than the other one did. And that is a type of interest. Now, again, at first glance, it sounds like this has nothing to do with loans. It has nothing to do with ribit. But even this kind of arrangement that might entail one person giving the other or expending more energy on behalf of the other than he or she received in kind, this too constitutes avak ribit. This too constitutes, again, sort of the broader circles, falls under the broader circles of the prohibition of ribit. Same way, right? You're not allowed to agree, I'll work with you during the summer, and you'll work with me during the winter, the rainy period, or vice versa, because again, working in one season is not the same as working in the other season. It requires different activities, different expense, different suffering, right? Different type of energies that you put out. And so that too could potentially constitute taking interest and is prohibited.
What if for you, it's, worth more? Like, I don't know, the heat doesn't bother you, but what you really desperately need is somebody who will work in the rainy season or, whatever it is. So that your assessment of the cost is different to somebody else's.
Yeah. I mean, I hear that, especially people are used to different climates, or they come from different parts of the world where they're used to one type of, one type of weather as opposed to the other. The Mishnah here seems to be assuming that there's a sort of generic standard, and ruling on the basis of that generic standard. Again, the point is, I think that the Mishnah here is making is that you have to be very careful when you're making these kinds of work arrangements to ensure that everybody gets equal, an equal investment on the part of their partner. Otherwise, it could potentially constitute the taking of interest. Again, it seems a little bit far-fetched at first glance, but it underscores, I think, the extent to which the rabbis viewed this prohibition as really being, as having a much larger purview than the Torah itself suggests in any way. And I want to, again, we're gonna
Shows
skip
a
over.
tremendous sensitivity.
Yeah, to the different types of interactions that could constitute that. And to underscore this particular point, we're going to skip through the beginning of the text. This is again still part of Mishnah Yud, but I want to pick up where it's in the middle of the paragraph where Rabbi Shimon says, "Yesh ribit dvarim." Right? Not only is there interest consisting of payment of money or items, but there's also verbal interest. What does verbal interest mean? And again, I want to remind you, this is sort of similar to the way chapter 4 spoke about verbal ona'ah, verbal oppression, right? In contrast to the basic category of oppression, which was financial oppression. And so here Rabbi Shimon says, what does that mean, verbal interest? For example, the borrower may not say to the lender, you should know that so-and-so has come from such and such a place when he's aware that this information is significant to his creditor, right? Because his intention is to provide a benefit to the lender, he's effectively paid him an extra sum for the money he lent him, which constitutes interest here. This might be like insider info, right? Insider tips, insider trading. That might fall into this kind of category. So even those kinds of sometimes verbal tips or verbal information, verbally conveyed information could constitute a type of interest because we understand that certain types of information, certain types of tips have a monetary value ultimately. And therefore they are prohibited.
I heard recently in a shiur that there is a question whether a person who had lent somebody money and the person then wrote a sefer, whether he can dedicate that sefer to the person who had lent him money because of onas dvarim, because of that.
Right, yeah, that's a nice example.
That goes under the same idea as this.
Yeah, exactly. And there again, it might not have a monetary value, but it has certainly a, kavod, or some kinds of, promotional value that might constitute this ribit dvarim. Okay, thank you very much for that. All right, we're going to conclude here for today. And again, hopefully you'll continue on with your study of mishnayot. This week you should be studying the mishnayot of chapter 6 and beginning the mishnayot of chapter 7 as well. And we will convene again next Sunday evening, which is Chol HaMoed, but I will be here nonetheless. And we can, I don't know if I'll be able to zoom in from my sukkah, but we can learn together on Sukkot. Okay.
I'm so sorry I was late. It was technical difficulty. I just couldn't get on.
No need to apologize. You're welcome whenever.
And thank you for welcoming me in. This is great. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Welcome to come again.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining. Chag Sameach.